let's first take a look at the shot that we're going to be working on. So this is a really cool shot. It's really well animated. And we've got a very specific setup here. So specifically, it's going to be on Jules, the guy on the left here. And if we look at the shot, he's got this surfboard that he has to wax. So he's putting wax on the surfboard, rubbing it down. The surfboard, if we look at it from the view here, is on the ground, sitting on the ground. So it has to pivot from the ground. It has to rest on his knee, and he has to hold it with his other hand. So this is a lot of things to keep track of and to make work correctly. And there's a lot of ways we can do this. The setup I'm going to be talking about here is one way of doing this. With constraints, a thing to keep in mind is that as long as you get a good product in the end, it doesn't really matter how you do it, as long as it makes your life easier. That's the goal. Otherwise, we might as well animate without constraints. So we've got all of these different elements that have to tie into each other. The surfboard has to move the... Yeah, it does look very hard. And in this case, if you don't do it correctly, what's going to end up happening is you're going to be fighting the polish phase so much, because everything is connected. Any motion with the foot and the leg moving should be bouncing the surfboard up and down. Any movement of the surfboard and the hand going across it should be rocking the surfboard this way, which means that this hand needs to follow and that hand needs to follow as it's polishing. The one that's polishing is going back and forth across the surfboard, which means that as this rotates, suddenly, this is an extreme example, this hand has to move up and around, and the wrist has to rotate all at the same time. It's a lot. And if we're not careful, again, this is going to be polish from hell, where it's just going to be a nightmare trying to get all of this working. Now, another thing we have here is that we already have existing animation. So what this means is any changes, so we've got this hand kind of going across the surfboard, any changes to this constraint setup that's already existing means that we might have to reanimate a whole section. That's not ideal either. Sometimes, and this happens a lot in shots, you're going to be animating a shot and you might have set up a constraint system that isn't quite working, or maybe you didn't set up the constraint system yet, but you kind of animated certain things, and now you reach the point where you need to refine the constraint setup. But we don't want to lose what we've already done. We want to kind of transfer it over. I'm going to show some ways of doing that as well. We may or may not keep the animation, but at least we'll have that option. This is the big thing. It's giving us ourselves an option so that we don't just lose all the work we've already done. So that's the setup that we have to figure out first. Now, before we start diving into this, I just want to show the basics of constraints, because there's a lot of different constraints that we can use and setups that we can use. And I want to show the pros and cons to them, especially for anyone who's kind of new to constraints or not too familiar with the process of them. So I've got this very basic scene here. We've just got all of these different sets, and I want to show the difference between the ways we can connect objects. So the first two here is going to be simple parenting. Now, parenting in Maya is basically a hierarchy system. You place one object under the hierarchy of another. So if we look at the outliner, we have the parent and the child. The cube is going to be the leading object here in all of these. So the parent and the child. And the way we parent something is you select the child first, then the parent, go to edit and parent, or hit the P key. And what this does is it places the child underneath the hierarchy of the parent. So it's basically contained with it, grouped with each other. This basically makes it so that the parent, wherever it goes, the child follows. Nice and easy. It's a good way of connecting things together. There are a few problems with this. The main one is that when you're doing a parent operation, just straight parenting, there is no on-off switch. So just like in real life, if you're a parent, you can't just wake up one day and go, ugh, these kids, nah, I'm going back to the bachelor life. Wait, yay, free, I'm free. No, you're a parent for life. Well, you could technically, but that just makes you a bad parent. No, just like in real life, we can't turn this on and off willy-nilly whenever we feel like it. Oh, today I feel like being a parent. Yay! No, doesn't work that way. So if we had an object where we've got a character who has to pick up an object and then put it back down, that's impossible. Once it's parented, it is stuck there, regardless. Now, the benefit of this is that with parenting, the child still has free will. It is still free to do its own thing. So it can move around, jump onto its parent for a piggyback ride, move around, it follows the parent, it can jump back off, and then it still follows. So you can still animate a child, which is very good. It makes it so that if I'm holding the pen, I can do this in my animation very easily. Because my hand is the parent, the pen is the child, and the child can do its own thing while still following. It allows for these more complex animations. Great. Now there is one other big negative to parenting, which is since it is hierarchy based, it takes one object and places into the hierarchy of the other. We cannot use this with a rig. A rig, in essence, is a giant hierarchy. So if I look at, for example, the Jules rig here, look at this. This is the Jules rig. It is just a giant hierarchy of objects. Look at that. That's the rig. Which means that if you try to, let's say, take a character's hand and have it follow another object, so he places his hand and that's being dragged around by something, what you're essentially doing is breaking the hand in order to get it to work, and it's just going to break the rig. It's not going to work. So parenting only really works with simple objects, simple props. That's it. As animators, that's a huge negative, because if you have a character, let's say you're animating something like Overwatch, where they've got these complex guns and they have to hold it in one hand and then use another hand to reload it, and you've got all of these moving parts, that gun is a big rig. If you were to try and just parent it to the hand, it would break the rig. It wouldn't work. So, parenting is useful, but as animators, not super helpful, because there's a lot of negatives that impact us quite a bit. Okay, next up, we have constraining. So, with constraining, we have a leader and a follower, not a parent and child. Technically, the terminology doesn't matter, but I like to use a different terminology because we have to select things differently. So, when you are constraining something, we need to select the leader first, then the follower. So leader, then follower. The cube, then the cylinder in this case. I'm going to go to the constraint menu here, and we've got a ton of different constraints. They all do something different. I'm not going to go into the super in-depth on each one of these here. But what I'm going to do is create a parent constraint. Now already this is starting to get a little confusing. So let's just create a quick parent constraint. And let me explain first what happens, and then we'll kind of go into the confusing elements here. So once I've created that constraint, if you look at the outliner, the follower now has a new node attached to it. The leader and follower are still separate. They haven't been placed in each other's hierarchy or anything. They just stay the same way they have been. And we get a new node, a constraint node, which is basically a little bit of math that's going, these two objects, connect them together. We also see that on the follower here, its attributes turn blue. This basically shows which attributes are constrained, which ones are locked. Okay, great. Now, a little bit on the confusing parts. First one, edit, parent, constrain, parent. A same name, it must do the same thing. No, they are totally different things that do totally different methods of connecting objects together. You cannot mix these two up. If you do, it's going to screw up everything. These are very different, and it's still confusing. The reason why we have a constraint parent is that it is a constraint that is mimicking what parenting does. It's mimicking the connection that parenting creates, but in a much more, let's say just in a different way. So the names are the same, but we have to be very clear on that. So as I'm going through this, I'm going to try to be very conscious of, well, if I'm talking about parenting, it's just parenting. If it's a constraint, it's going to be constraint parent. So that's the first thing. The second thing that we can kind of get lost on here is one of the big negatives of constraints. So we've created the constraint. Well, actually, before I address that, let's actually go over the other confusing bit, which gets a lot of people when they start learning this stuff, is the selection order. When we selected the constraint, we selected the leader first, the object that leads, and then the follower, the object that follows. With parenting, we selected the child first, the object that follows, then we selected the object that leads, the parent. It's backwards. This can get a lot of people confused when you're first starting out, because if you select them the wrong way, suddenly things aren't working correctly and you've constrained it or parented it backwards and mess. The way I was taught to remember this is, with parenting, a good parent always puts the child first. When you're parenting something, you take the child, then the parent. With a leader or a constraint, the leader goes first. A good leader will charge into battle with his men. He will lead the battle. You select the leader first, then the follower. So as long as you keep that in mind, and whatever mnemonic you can remember it for, it kind of gives you that easy selection method. Again, the big reason is if you select it backwards, it kind of screws things up. Now, with all of this, let's actually go into the actual negatives and pros about constraints. So if we take this, we can see, hey, it works. Just like parenting above it, it selects it, yay, it moves it. Yay, it moves it. Whee! So good, they can both lock objects together. Great. Now the pros about constraint, the big one, is that because we are not adjusting anything in the hierarchy, we can use this with rigs. All we're doing is adding an extra little bit of code, a little bit of a node in there that connects objects together. So when we're dealing with a rig, that's very easy to do. It's just taking the control of the rig, adding an extra little bit of code there. Now it follows along. Yay. Good and easy. As animators, that's great because we're working with rigs all the time. The other thing, we can turn these on and off. So a quick, simple way of turning on a constraint is take your constrained object, hit S to set a key on it, and you're going to have a blend attribute right here. This will allow you to turn the constraint on and off. So you can see, doesn't follow. Take that blend, turn it on, it follows. We can have a character pick something up and drop it. Yay. As animators, that's again huge because it gives us the freedom to actually properly animate someone picking something up. Okay. So 2 really big pros for us. And Tranquility, thank you so much for the subscription. Oh man, 5 months already. Geez, thank you so much for that. Really appreciate that. I love this song. I don't know why. But we've got some really great pros. So already we're thinking, oh, constraints as animators. Man, this is great. What can go wrong? It's one big thing, which ruins constraints completely for us as animators. Let's say I want to have this cylinder have a piggyback ride on the cube, just like we did before. Put that there. Everything follows along. Okay. Put that there. Oop. It snaps back. You cannot animate a constrained object. It cannot be animated. It is locked. It is constrained. That is what it is. It's like a lock and shackle. It is stuck where it is. as animators, that's essentially shooting ourselves in the foot because we lose the ability to animate our job description. So that would be, if I was to take this pen and constrain it into my hand here, let's say I hold it like this, no matter how I move my fingers, that pen is going to be just locked there and I can't do anything else. It's just locked in place. It'll follow the hand great, but I can't do something like this where I'm spinning it in my hand. Not good. So, how do we approach that? How do we get a better system? Well, from there, we start going into combinations of systems. And there's two main ways that we can set up a constraint and parenting, I guess you could say, setup that will give us the best of both worlds. And they both work a little differently, but the end result is similar. It really is just the complexity. So, the first setup is a hybrid setup. A hybrid setup is basically using parenting and constraining together in a very simple way that will give us the best of both worlds. So, the way we set this up is, once again, we have a leader, we have our follower, but we've added something. We've added a locator. I also tend to call this a buffer. It gives us an extra little element that we can use to enhance this setup. And essentially what it does is it lets us combine things together. So the way we're going to do this, we want the leader to lead the object and then the follower, well, to follow. So the way I'm going to do this is I'm going to take the locator and parent it to the leader. Straight parent. Like the child first, then the parent, and hit P. You can see the locator now follows along. And we can see that right there. And since it's a child, we can still animate this however we want. Now, we'll take the follower and constrain it to the locator. So, once again, it's leader, then follower. So we select the locator, the object that's leading, then the follower, constrain parent. So what does this give us? Well, the cube now, if I move this, it moves the locator, which is a child. The locator then moves the cylinder because it is constrained together. This gives us our hybrid setup. And what's powerful about this is because the locator is still a child, I can still animate this wherever I want. There we go. Now we can get that piggyback ride again. But because the cylinder is constrained, I can turn that off whenever I want. I could take this, set a key, make sure I don't set a key on the whole thing, and there we go. Now I can just drop that off. Aha! Want that piggyback ride again? Boop! There we go. We've just got the best of both worlds just by adding one locator in there. So that makes our whole setup much more, well, as an animator, it's useful. Just this is a very simple setup that'll allow you to do most constraints in most shots. But there are limitations to this. Specifically, because we're just dealing with one locator, we're going to have moments where we might not have the pivot point exactly where we want it. So for example, whenever this is constrained, I have to animate the locator in order to move the cylinder. This means that as I move this and try to rotate it, you can see it's rotating from the locator itself. If I don't get that locator in the right spot, so right now it's way off, that's going to be rotating from a weird spot. And that means I have to readjust my whole constraint if I want to adjust that. That's a pain. The other thing is, because we're parenting the locator to the object here, it gets put into the hierarchy of the object. So the leader, it gets put into the hierarchy of the leader. In this case, that's not so bad. Look at that. The locator is right here. Easy to find. Yeah, no problem. Okay, let's parent. I'm just going to create another locator here. Just random locator. Let's parent this to this hand here. So I'm going to select the locator. We can see locator 3. Select the wrist and hit P. Okay, where is it? If I need to find it in my hypershade here, or sorry, hypershade, my outliner here, it's time to start digging. Where, oh where, oh where is my locator? That's not fun. Having to dig through a rig to find your locator so you can do something in the outliner is nightmarish. In most cases, you won't have to, but if you're dealing with a more complex situation like this one here, suddenly this becomes a pain. Now, a quick way to do this, if ever you have to find something, select the locator, and in the outliner, just hit the F key, and you'll find it right there. It'll open it up right to that. F is find or focus. There we go. But it still opened up this whole hierarchy that's a pain to look through. It's not great. Is it a big inconvenience? No, it's more of a minor inconvenience and kind of just makes things a little longer to do. But when you're dealing with something like this, where you're going to have a constraint setup for the hand, so you've got a constraint setup for one hand here, a second hand here, an object in that hand, the surfboard, and the knee. If all of those are being constrained and put into the rig in random spots, that gets to be very confusing to find anything. Not ideal. Okay. How do we make a better constraint system that gives us more control? Even more control than this one does here. This is a basic setup that works well in most cases. This is not most cases. So the next setup here is a locator hierarchy. This is, at least for me, my favorite constraint setup because it gets you the best of both worlds and so much freedom. If you master this constraint setup, you can do so many things. The possibilities in your animation is just, it's hard to focus on at the beginning, and I'll show an example here, but literally it's mind-blowing once you start doing this yourself and exploring the concepts. I didn't like this method when I first learned it way back when I was a student, but the more I use it, and even now, I'll use this setup, and it literally takes a shot that would have taken days or a week to clean up to making it so I can clean it up in an hour or less. So this setup is insanely powerful. And thank you for the drinking reminder. I think I missed another one, so I'll take 2 sips. So what is this setup? So a locator hierarchy is basically adding more locators and using them to create offsets and extra controls for our constraint. You can almost think of it like very basic rigging. We're creating this constraint rig that will allow us to have full control. So this is the kind of the most basic setup we have here. Once again, we have our leader, we have our follower, and what I've done is I've created 3 locators. I've created the first locator here, and this is my constraint to the leader. So the first locator is going to be constrained to the leader. Naming these can be very helpful. Try not to just leave it as locator 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. That gets very confusing. We have another one here, which is going to act as our the object that we can use to animate the cylinder. Very similar to this here. It is basically going to be this locator. We then have a third locator, which is going to be a pivot offset locator. Basically, this will allow us to move the pivot wherever we want. Okay. We've got this. How do we set this up? Basically, we just need to create a hierarchy with all these locators. So, to do this, I'm going to take my pivot point locator here. I'm going to parent it to the follower control right there. I'm going to take both of these and parent that to the constraint to leader right here. So now this constraint moves everything, and we can go down and you can see how each one affects a little less and a little less. Okay, great. How does this help us? Well, let's just finish setting it up and we'll see how that works. So, constraint deleter, or constraint to leader. This locator is going to basically act as our way of connecting everything together. And instead of parenting it like we did with the setup up here, I'm going to constrain it. So select the leader first, then the follower, constrain parent. There we go. Now, as I move the cube, everything moves along. Great. Now let's get the cylinder to follow. So the cylinder has to be constrained. So we're going to constrain that to the lowest object in the hierarchy, which in this case is the pivot offset. So take the leader, then the follower, constrain parent. Great. So with just this, hey, look at that. It's working. Yay. So far it seems very similar to this, except right away we've got one really nice benefit. We don't have any parenting to the rig. Everything was constrained, which means that when we look at our outliner here, our whole constraint setup, everything that we need is right there. Easy to find, easy to see. Compared to this, where you have to dig through a rig to find every locator. So already, hey, it's clean. It's nice. Okay, is that really the only benefit? Oh yeah, we're being a little cleaner. Yay. Why create 3 locators when we can have 1? This is where it gets really powerful. So let's say we were animating this and okay, we can move this around. Okay, piggyback ride. Yay, it works. Whoopee. But as we rotate this, oh man, I got my pivot point wrong. It needs to pivot from that bottom edge right here. I have this offset. Because the offset is parented to the main locator control right there, all I have to do is move this here. And now it pivots from the bottom edge. Oh dang, it has to roll over and pivot from the top edge. Take that offset. Whoop. And then pivots from the top edge. Aha. This is insanely powerful because we now have the ability to not only animate this the way we would normally do, we can change a pivot point, which, for example, if you're doing a pen spin, look at where the pen is spinning as I do this. It's near the tip, then it's spinning from the middle, and then if I keep going, spins from further down, back to the middle, back to the front. The pivot point is changing the whole time. If you have a constraint setup like this, that becomes super easy to animate. All you're doing is animating the offset and rotating. That's it. I can have this object rotate from any point I want at any time. As an animator, that is huge. And this is the most basic version of this. If you take this and go even further, so let's get this back into a basic position here. So I've got one more version here. This is just an updated version. So let's take a look at this. Same thing, we just added more layers. So we've got the constraint to leader. Great. Well, I added a spin locator right here over the top. So let's say, as we're animating this, not only does this object have to move around with the cube, but as the cube is moving, this needs to basically be rotating in some way, but it also needs to spin around the object like a planet. Maybe we're animating some sort of solar system, and we've got all these planets that are rotating, and maybe an asteroid collides into one and knocks it off of its orbit, all of this cool stuff. But the core is that they have to keep spinning around the main planet. Well, if I was to try and do this here, I would have to take this and move it and rotate it. And oh God, this is going to be a pain because I need to get a whole orbit here. Or I take my spin locator. Whee! I can just animate that, put it on a cycle. I've got a constant spin that's done. Perfect spin. Okay. As that's spinning, we also need it to pivot from maybe the top or bottom. So I've got my top pivot right here. I could have it spin and kind of maybe the G-force is starting to cause it to bow out and kind of go out further and further, which let's actually just do that. I'm going to animate this here. Let's say we'll just do 24 frames. In 24 frames, it's got to spin all the way around. And as it goes, let's make this a little bit more interesting. It's going to start slow and just speed up faster and faster and faster. Okay, so we've got that already. Perfect orbit. Yay. Okay, well, as it's spinning, what if we want it to go out further? So maybe it starts close, like here, but by the end, maybe that G-force has started to push it further and further away. Whoop. Like that. Look at that. Done. Okay. As that's happening, it also has to spin and rotate. But I want it to rotate from this edge right here. Well, if I rotate this right now, it's rotating from the top edge, or the top middle. I have my offset here. You can see it right there, my top offset locator. Let's just move that here, reposition that. And now I can use that first locator once again. Animate it rotating out this way. Now, as it rotates, maybe we'll have that hold a little longer. Something like that. The G-forces cause the object to start spinning outwards. Done. So we've just created a decently complex animation setup with little to no work. Just a few curves, done. If you were to try to animate this on your own, this could be nightmarish, especially considering all of the while here, the cube itself can be moving. So we've got that. I could even, let's take the cube and just rotate it like crazy here. So now we've got this. Done. I can make any adjustments I want, and everything else still works perfectly. This kind of setup is amazingly powerful. And this is just a very basic form. If you really start to understand this, you can basically make a lot of setups that you would think would be very complex and a pain to animate, and turn it into literally minutes of work. So once again, I know this is probably, yes, like you said there, Scarred Ace, I'm using maximum brain power to understand this. I was the same way. When I was taught this, it's like, try to process it, and why would I use this, and why does it need so many levels? It just takes time. The best way to learn this is to do it, honestly. The more you do it, the more it'll make sense. But to try and kind of explain it again, it's basically the more levels you have, the more control and pivot points you're able to create. So we can create this complex setup, or what looks like complex, but it's really just adding locators into a hierarchy and making it so that we have this more detailed constraint. So we have a locator that's dedicated to spinning. We have a locator that's dedicated to the top pivot point. We have a locator that's dedicated to creating the offset to that pivot point. We have a bottom pivot point. If I suddenly need to animate this rotating from the bottom here, I can do that. I can adjust where it pivots with the bottom offset, like so. So it's just giving us options. And the more you create locators, the more locators you create, I should say, the more options you give yourself. That's pretty much it. And once again, this is one of those things that you have to kind of do yourself to really understand. So there's a question here. Would this work with 2 character rigs? Yes, it would. Because they are just constrained to the leader and the follower, in this case the cube and the cylinder, they're just constrained. This would work with any rig. And could you start the hierarchy? Which part specifically? So in terms of the hierarchy, it's really just taking all of these locators, parenting them together. Definitely make sure to name them so you know what each one does, what the goal of them is going to be. And then you constrain the objects to this. And again, the more levels you have, the more control you have. At a very basic level, you just need 3 locators. And that gives you a lot of control already. So, I know this is very confusing, but hopefully as we go through the demo, I'm going to be creating a few more of these, and hopefully it'll make sense the more we do it. Again, I was in the same boat when I first learned these. It's just a complex way of wrapping your brain around it, but it does become easier. So we'll be doing a few of these. Just to ask, is the shape on the left meant to be something like hands while the right object is the thing being held? Yeah, you could look at it that way. It could be a hand, it could be the head and there's a hat sitting on top of it. It could be a hand holding a pen. It could be a pipe in someone's mouth. It could be anything. Something that's leading and something that's following. That's really what it is. So, that is the basics of the different constraint setups that we can use as animators. Parenting and constraining, just to kind of summarize. Basic parenting, basic constraining, as animators, they are nice, but kind of useless because there's so many big negatives to each one that using them on their own doesn't work, doesn't give us everything we need. At the very minimum, we want a hybrid system, which is basically one locator, and then you constrain and parent things together that way. At the very least, this is going to give you the most, it's going to give you the best of both worlds with none of the negatives, but it is limited in the power that constraints can give you. The ultimate power that constraints can give you in a shot and make things easier to work with. The ultimate constraint setup is a locator hierarchy, where you have a bunch of locators in a hierarchy and then you use those. So let's go back to the shot and we'll kind of think through this. We'll leave this for now, let it simmer in the brain, switch topics a little bit, more in the planning phase, and then we'll come back and create the locator setups we need. So I'm basically just adding sort of points to contact that can be constrained to the object, kind of. You're adding different points that you can pivot from and move from. I can follow everything you're doing, but it seems like a lot of planning would be required. Yes, and this is something I always do with my constraints. I always plan my constraints out. I try not to just jump into a scene and just start constraining things willy-nilly, especially when you're dealing with complex constraints, because we need to know what should affect what, and we have to start thinking of, as we go further in the shot, what areas might cause problems. Unfortunately, when you're first starting out, that's hard to do because you don't know what areas are going to cause problems. As you gain more experience, this is going to become easier. And Johan, I'd be happy to take a look at your biped rig after the demo here. So let's go into that planning phase a little bit. So we've got our shot here. like we were saying before, is a complex shot. We've got a character who has to be polishing or waxing their surfboard. So that hand has to follow the surfboard. The surfboard is pivoting from the ground over here while also resting on the character's knee. The other hand is holding up and supporting the surfboard. And all of this has to happen with the surfboard reacting to the motions, reacting to the character placing his hand down and basically not screwing anything up. So, with the setup that we have here, this is going to be very problematic. So the setup that we have right now, so I just opened the scene, it works, but there's a few things that are going to be a problem in the polishing phase. So first off, we're animating the surfboard from this locator right here at the end. That animates the surfboard, great. The problem is none of the hands are following. The knee isn't following, which, okay, that's not too bad, quick constraints. But the area that might cause a lot of problems is that currently the hand is being animated to go across the surfboard. So you can see the hand right here, the wrist, is the thing that's being animated and going across the surfboard. This means that any changes to the surfboard, so let's say this is the contact frame right here where the wax touches the surfboard. If I make a polishing change and suddenly that surfboard moves just a little bit, that ruins the whole animation. I have to redo this stuff on the hand. I'm going to be fighting these two things independently like crazy. So I would redo this setup. Now, the way I would plan for this is just take all the separate elements and figure out how we want things to lead. And this is what I do in my own shots. I'll just take a piece of paper or draw it on the computer, draw out my elements, and then just connect them. So we've got, in this scene, both hands, left and right. We've got the wax, which is just this little puck thing here. We've got the leg, or the knee specifically. The knee. We've got the surfboard, and we've got the ground. These are all the elements that we have to work with in this shot. So, the first thing we have to ask ourselves is, what leads? What leads this action? What is the biggest thing that's happening in this shot and that will influence everything else? Now, this is not specifically the thing that moves most. The thing that moves most is the hand waxing the surfboard. So that is the most motion. But what leads is the object that will influence the most, where any change can affect a lot. And exactly, it is the surfboard. The surfboard, depending on how we animate the surfboard, is going to affect where the knee is positioned, where the hand holding it is positioned. It'll also affect the hand waxing it. If that surfboard has a little bit of a rotation, all of the animation on the hand has to be redone if we constrain it incorrectly. The surfboard is the leading object here. And usually leading objects are the objects that are really heavy or really kind of, they hold another object in place. So for example, if I do this, the leading object is not the pen, it's the wrist. Because as I move my wrist, that is the thing that's really affecting the pen. The pen is just moving through my fingers like this. But let's say we have a character, I don't have another object here. Maybe they're driving a motorcycle and we want them to rev the engine and like steer along. In this case, it's not the hand that's the leading object, it's the motorcycle handle, because that's the thing that's leading all the both hands and affecting it the most. The hand is just animated over top of that. So by first asking ourselves what leads, that's going to be huge. That really lets us focus on how we can constrain the objects here. The next question that we need to start asking ourselves is, let me think of the best way to phrase this, it's basically how complex do we want to make the constraint? Now, this is where you will have the oh, actually, there's a question here. Or if you have the full motorcycle, it will be the body of the motorcycle that leads? Yes. So the body of the motorcycle will be the main leading force. Then it'll be the handlebars second, followed by the hands on top of the handlebars. So where the main body goes, that affects the handlebar. Then you use the handlebar. Then you get to the hands. It's a hierarchy. And then you've got the hips on top of the main body as well. So what I mean by how complex do we want the constraint to be really comes down to what do we need to have happen. In this case, the big thing is, let's say the surfboard is the leading action. So I want to be able to move this. Okay. Well, what about the knee? I want that knee to work with the surfboard. What if the character has to roll their foot up like this and their knee goes up and it pushes the surfboard up? That's a big thing. I don't want this knee to stretch and just distort in weird ways. I want good control. In this case, I would need to create a constraint setup where the main motion is coming from the surfboard, but the surfboard is also affected by the knee's position. That's a little bit more complex. We need the main rocking motion to be controlled by the surfboard, but the main up and down to be the leg, because the leg has the limitations. It has to be touching the ground. The knee cannot stretch and just move randomly. I would have a very specific setup if I had a shot that was framed here. But this is the way the shot is framed. We don't see the leg. We don't even see the upper leg. We don't see the foot. All we see is a little bit of the lower leg. We don't even see where the knee is contacting. So now I have a choice. Do I create a more complex setup to create a realistic way of moving it where the knee affects the surfboard correctly? Or do I keep the constraint a little bit simpler and cheat it because we don't see it? Honestly, in this case, cheating it is probably going to be the easiest way, because then we have full control over the animation of the surfboard itself, which just makes it easier to animate versus trying to get the knee and the surfboard to work together to create a final animation. But this is something we have to ask ourselves. What is the audience going to see? And how complex do I need to make this in order to get the results I need? Because we don't see the foot and the leg, we can simplify it. We can keep it easier on ourselves and still get great results. No problem. So the next thing is, let me write it down here. So how complex? And this goes for a lot of different things. So for example, the hand. We kind of asked this ourselves already, but it's got to be waxing the surfboard. Well, if I'm animating it the way it's constrained right now, I'm fighting this. So I need the surfboard to lead that action already. So how complex is the motions? Okay. Once you know that and you start answering these questions, sometimes it's easy, sometimes it takes a lot more time. You want to ask this about all the different elements. So going back to the shot here, the hand holding the wax, the hand has to follow the surfboard. Okay, we got that. Hand supporting the surfboard, hand follows the surfboard. Got that. Knee, like we talked about before, because of this camera angle, we can have the knee follow the surfboard and we're not going to have a problem. If it was framed up in this way, where we see that leg very clearly, we would have to think this through differently. Okay, so we've got that starting to boil in our brain. So let's see, it is the easiest way. I've had a lot of feedback where mentors have told me, even though we can't see it in the shot, we can tell that you didn't do it you did not do the full-on constraint. Yeah, it's definitely a choice. Now, this doesn't mean that when we constrain the leg that we ignore it completely. It just means that we're animating it a little differently. And this is a very clear distinction. When you don't see something on screen, so for example, you can't see my hips, you can't see my lower body, it doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. It doesn't mean that as I'm doing this, my hips are just totally still. Everything's still moving down below this. And if it's affecting the top half, I need to animate it. Now, in the case of the leg here, what my choice is not that I'm ignoring the leg, just to make sure that this is clear. It's not that I'm ignoring the leg. I'm just choosing how I'm going to animate the leg. Whether I animate the leg using the surfboard as the main motion, which is going to dictate whether the leg goes up or down, or if I animate the foot, which then affects the knee, which then affects the surfboard. That's what I'm asking myself. Which way do I want to go with this? If I have to animate the foot, which affects the knee, which affects the surfboard, while the surfboard also pivots on the ground, that's just a much more complex setup. Is it bad? No, but it's more work. Because we don't see the exact connection here, I can have the surfboard affect the knee and then just animate the foot to match where the knee should go. And it's going to be close enough that no one will know, and it'll be nice and easy. So it's really just which way do we want to go with this? And there's no distinct answer. It's really dependent on your shot. Okay. So we've pretty much got all of that. Okay. What's next? Well, the next thing I like to do personally is just start mapping it out a little bit. So we've got our little kind of objects here. Let's map this out. So the leading object, the first thing that's going to be the main object is the surfboard. So we'll take that surfboard. Okay, this is going to be our leader. And it's going to control everything that ends up happening. Okay, now with this leader, it needs to control, well, in this case, let's actually look at the shot. It needs to control the red hand here. And the red hand is the right hand on this rig. So it needs to control that directly. Straight there. Now this doesn't mean a straight constraint, but it's just 1-to-1. Where the surfboard goes, that hand has to go. Because of the complexity of the shot, the surfboard should also control the knee, based on our camera angle here. The surfboard will control the knee directly. 1-to-1, where the surfboard goes, that's where the knee goes. Okay, great. Now, we've got the other hand. The other hand is holding something. We have more questions to ask ourselves. How is it going to be controlled? As I constrain the hand to the surfboard, do I want the hand to hold on to the wax, or do I want the wax to control where the hand goes? So do I want it in this order, like this, or do I want it inversed, where we do this? And Vashi Boy, hey, thank you so much for the subscription. Oh no, wait, Animouth, oh geez, thank you so much for the gift. Oh geez, thank you so much, I really appreciate that. And Vashi, welcome to the subs. That's awesome, thank you so much. So do we want to do it the other way, where the hand leads the wax in this case? Well, in all honesty, it won't make a huge difference here. We could go either way. The big thing though is what's connecting here. In this shot, it's the wax that's connecting with the surfboard. The hand, it might rub against it a little bit, but the wax is the thing that has to rub specifically on top of the surfboard. That's a very specific thing. So if we have the hand constrained to the wax and we animate the wax, it'll be much easier to get that very precise motion across there. We can then have that wax going exactly on the path that we want, and then because the hand is constrained to the wax is doing its own thing, the hand can just adjust on top so that as it's holding, it's not just locked in, it can do its own thing. And we layer that over top. If we did it the other way, where the hand is the leading force, okay, it's moving, and okay, now we want the wax to adjust in the hand. Because the hand is the leading force, that means that we'll adjust the wax, it'll move, and then it's not going to line up with the surfboard anymore. It's going to be misaligned, which means we have to realign the wrist to realign the wax, and it's a pain. So, because of that simple fact, we have that very precise contact between two objects. If we go this way, we're going to get a much better connection. We're going to have better options and better polish out of this setup much more easily. So once again, it's planning it out, just mapping it out like this. Now, I will say, if you're just starting out with constraints or animation, you're not going to know about a lot of this. This is stuff that comes with experience. But what I recommend is map it out anyway. Just try to think about it. How do you think this is going to work? Okay, I think it's going to do this and this and this. Map it out, draw it out, just take notes. And then, more likely when it doesn't work, because when you're starting out, often things will go wrong. When it doesn't work, remap it. Think about it. Okay, why didn't it work? Okay, what if I do this different thing? That's going to teach you constraints much faster because you're actively thinking about them. You're not just jumping in and hoping to apply a constraint in some way. You're mapping it out. When it fails, you will have that kind of visual guide of going, oh, this didn't work. Let's try it this way. And you keep doing that until you find the way that works, and then you'll have that visual map of the right way to do it, compared to just the random steps in your head that you were using and kind of undoing, redoing, and whatnot to hopefully get something to work. Mapping it out is very useful. So, with this, we can start mapping it out even more if we wanted to. So, this is really just taking notes at this point. And you can take notes in all sorts of different ways. One thing I like to think about when I'm doing this is, where are my pivot points going to be? So, on all of these, where do I need these objects to move from? Well, so the surfboard is pretty easy. It's going to pivot from the ground, where it's sitting on the ground, and technically it's going to be pivoting from the knee. But because of the constraint setup we're going to be doing, the knee was just going to be following the surfboard. So we don't have to worry about that too much. So we have that basic setup for the surfboard, pivot from the ground. Simple. The knee is going to be moving from that point right there. That's the point that is pushing against the surfboard. That's where we have to connect it to. We can't connect the foot. We need to connect the knee itself. Okay. Now, the hand holding the surfboard, this is going to be very important. The hand by default rotates from the wrist. If it's holding on the surfboard, it's not pivoting from the wrist anymore. If I'm holding an object, I'm going to be pivoting from here, most likely. So let's see if I have my water bottle here. If I put my hand on here, do this. I'm pivoting from the base of my fingers, not my wrist. Now you could technically do this, but if you're holding a heavy object, it's very hard to just move your wrist like this. You're going to be doing this motion, more likely. So we need a pivot point somewhere along here. And this can change depending on the objects. What if your character's holding something like this? Now the pivot points are from the fingertips. What if they've got their hand on the edge of the object? Now your pivot point is from the edge of the hand here. Think about how your character is holding that. And that'll give you kind of your main focus. And it can change too, where, for example, with the pen, the pivot point could be in the center, and then as you move, now it goes to the end, and then it can pivot from the other end here. We want to think about that. Where's our pivot points going to be? Okay, the wax. The wax is going to be pretty simple in the sense that it's just going to be going across the surface, but the main sliding motion of the wax is going to be pivoting from the center. That way, as it's on the surface, we can just kind of roll it across the surface very easily. With that said, as the wax contacts the surface or gets pulled off of the surface, it pivots from the edge. It doesn't just lift off. Well, you could technically lift off nice and evenly, but more often there's going to be a little rotation. And because it's on the surface, it's going to be rotating from an edge. So we need a pivot point on the edge. More likely the edge that's kind of away from the wrist, so you can pull it up this way. The wrist, well, it's going to be constrained with the wax right in the center, so its pivot point is going to be around the wax. So most likely right in the palm of the hand. Okay. We know where our objects are going to be pivoting from. This is very crucial because this is where we're going to be putting our locators. This is where we're going to be planning out how all of these will move. Okay. So we can keep going with this. One other thing I like to do typically is I will just map out my locators. You don't have to do this in drawing form. You could just do it in Maya, but I like to do it on paper just to kind of give me an idea of what I need. So let's actually, no, I'm going to do this in Maya just because it's going to be easier to show you as I go, but just keep in mind I would draw this out. The reason why I'm going to do it in Maya is I can show you exactly why I'm adding the locator versus just describing it and miming it. So we've got our setup here. Great. Let's start actually setting it up. Finally, after an hour, we're ready to start doing this. So there's a few things here that I do want to do first. So let's say you're animating on this shot and you've got this whole setup good, but now, like we have to redo our constraints because something's not, maybe we constrained them the wrong way, or something's not working, or maybe we just haven't created a constraint yet. The big thing is we need to be able to save out our animation that we already have. If I'm going to be deleting all of this and rebuilding it from scratch, I don't want to lose it all. I don't want to just throw out all the animation that we've got so far just because. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to save it. Now, let's see. This is also a point where miming the motion is very useful. If he were to, say, be waxing the board whilst angry, he would probably put more force. Yeah, so doing that can really help. Like, just think of how you're going to be moving it and how the wrists would move when you're thinking of the pivot points. So, to save out the animation, it's pretty simple. So the first thing here is the surfboard. We've got this locator right here, which is moving it from the tip of the surfboard. I just want to keep this animation in place because it's the thing that's moving the surfboard throughout the shot. Honestly, there's not too many keys here, so I can just keep this. Yay. Because this is the leading object and the surfboard is constrained, all I need to do is just delete the constraint on the surfboard. So right here, boop. And that locator is still animated, but the surfboard now stays still. Great. So I'll take this locator and I'm just going to rename it. So I'm going to call this old. That way I make sure I don't accidentally select it later on. The old surfboard step ground. And I'm just going to turn off its visibility. So let's delete that. Turn that off. There we go. Cleaning up the scene here. Next, this hand is animated. It's moving through and we've got the hand waxing the surfboard. I don't want to lose this animation, but because of the way we're going to be reconstraining it, the hand is going to be constrained, which means all of this animation might go away. So the way I'm going to save it is I'm going to create a new locator. Oop, like so. Let's call this old hand anim. And I'm going to constrain it to the wrist. So select the wrist, the leader, then the follower, the locator. Constrain, parent, and I'm going to open up the options and turn off maintain offset. What this does is it snaps the locator to the wrist. You can see it right there. Now, that locator is snapped to the wrist. It follows along perfectly. Great. What I can now do is select the locator, go to Edit, Keys, Bake Simulation. Baking the simulation, what that does is it takes animation that is created using things like constraints. Constraints are, or in this case, the locator is animated, it's moving, but there's no actual animation on it. It is a simulation. It is locked to another object, which is causing it to move. Baking a simulation takes motion that is created by an outside source and turns it into keyframe animation so that the locator itself is going to be animated. So I can take this, let's go to our settings here. I'm just going to reset them. Usually that's all we need to do. And let's see. So the big thing is going to be the sample by right here. The sample by basically means how many keys it's going to put. Right now, this means it's going to put a key every single frame, every frame. If I do this 2, it'll put a key every 2 frames. Normally what I like to do is set it smart bake, which will try to put keys wherever there are keys and kind of keep your curves simpler. So we'll just bake that. So it'll take a little bit here. Yeah, I should have hidden the viewport. And there's a foot. So let's see. How come you don't freeze the locator? Freezing the locator in this case won't save out the animation. Basically what I'm going to end up doing here is I'm going to delete all the animation on the wrist so that I know that the wrist isn't going to be causing any problems. And I want to be able to have a backup of it. If something goes wrong, I want to be able to keep that animation from the wrist just in case. And this way I can transfer it on to something else later. Okay, so with this, that locator now, you can see it's still moving, but is no longer constrained. You can see it's actually keyed right now. You look at the graph editor, there's its keys. This means I can take my wrist. I'm just going to, let's just take all of this here, hit delete. Now that wrist is no longer animated. You can see right there, but the locator is still moving where the wrist was going. I have my backup. So this is my hand animation backup, basically. With that, I can just take the visibility, turn that off for now. So we've got our old surfboard and our whole old hand animation still in our shot. But now we have the ability to just redo all of our constraints with no worry about mixing what we had before, what we have what we're going to be making, and we still have our backup. So from this point, let's actually just get rid of all the constraints and locators that we don't need anymore. So this is for Aya. Let's move that down here. So for the sponge, I'm just going to get rid of this locator. We're going to remake that constraint setup. Now the sponge has just dodged out of the hand. Where did it go? Okay. Let's see here. Let me undo. Okay. Interesting. Something about locator. Okay, good. There we go. I just had to delete it in the right way. So what I was doing was I was deleting the locator first, which the sponge was constrained to, and it was resetting the position. By deleting the constraint first and then the locator, it kept the sponge in the right spot. So it just made it a little easier to line things up. Okay, we're ready to go. So let me just simplify the scene here. So we've got our sponge, we've got our surfboard, and then we've got all of our controls that we're going to be dealing with. So what's the first thing we need to do? Well, we need to get the surfboard set up so that the surfboard can be animated and controlled. It is the leader. It's going to be the thing that affects everything else. So that's going to be the first constraint setup we need to do. Now, to set this up, it's going to be pivoting from the tip that's sitting on the ground. So very similar to the setup from before, I'm just going to create a locator. So create locator and place it at the tip of the surfboard. Now, the way I'm going to place it at the tip is I'm just going to hold down the V key. V is the point snap tool, and just middle mouse drag right on the point there. So that's going to get that perfect pivot point right there. Now, if I wanted to be even more picky about it, technically the surfboard is going to be pivoting from the bottom edge. So I could put the locator right there. Okay. So we've got our locator, and this is going to be our, let's call this surfboard pivot. Now, we could just leave it at that. We could just constrain the surfboard to this, done. The problem with that is that we begin to lose a little bit of control over things. Specifically, to make this work correctly, if I constrain this just the way it is now, so let's take the surfboard here and make sure it's not referenced. There we go. Surfboard, and constrain it to the locator. So like that, and make sure maintain offset is not turned on. Or sorry, that it is turned on. Let's add that. We constrain it just like this, and okay, it can move this way, great. But the locator is not lined up to the surfboard. You'll notice that as I try to rotate it kind of side to side, see how it's twisting the surfboard in this really weird way? That's going to be a nightmare to work with. Normally, when we're dealing with stuff like this, we want the locators to line up with our objects. This makes it easier to work with. So, how do we get this to line up? Well, honestly, it's pretty simple. I'm going to undo my constraint, so nothing's constrained now. And I'm going to take the locator and constrain it to the surfboard first. So, take the surfboard, then the locator, constrain, parent, and turn off maintain offset. So this will snap the locator to match the surfboard's position right there. I can then delete the constraint and move that locator back down. Whoop, like that. You can see how now this locator is perfectly aligned with the surfboard. This will make it so that as we rotate the locator, everything lines up correctly. Great. This is very much the same setup that we had before we started this. So yay, that's great. But there is a negative to just this, which is if I constrain the surfboard to the locator right now, so we're going to maintain offset on, let's add that constraint. Now as we rotate this, we get that perfect pivot point from the center. Great, everything works as is, as we want it to be. But we've got a couple of issues. One, the surfboard's not really supposed to pivot from the center. It's supposed to pivot from the knee. Two, if we have to make any big changes, we can start running into a lot of issues repositioning this. We might have to redo a lot of animation. We might also get some gimbal issues with this. So what I would recommend, it's not necessary. This is kind of a prevention element. It's not necessary. This is more than enough. A prevention element is adding an extra layer here. So let me undo the constraint and I'll show you what I mean by the extra layer. So instead of just one surfboard pivot right here, I would create another locator. Let's reset its rotations so it's just zeroed out. And I'll just move it over to the side here. And we'll call this surfboard main locator. So this is basically our, you can almost use it as a root control. And let's actually call this root. It's using it as that same purpose. It's a way for us to get additional control. So we've got our root locator. I'm going to parent the pivot to the root, like so. And then I'm just going to constrain the surfboard to the locator that we had before. So, is it really that much different? No, not really. But what this does is it simplifies these attributes. You can see the values are much cleaner now. They're not as kind of crazy wild. It makes it easier to reset the surfboard back to its default location. The other thing that it does is it gives us the ability to globally offset this surfboard with this control. And as I rotate this is going to be an extreme example. The rotation of the surfboard still stays simple. It's giving us that ability to make huge adjustments without losing the axis along the surfboard's edge, if that makes sense. Okay. That's pretty much it for this main pivot point here. Was it that much? No, you don't even need this, but we've got that set up right here. Okay. Let's go to the knee. So we've got the surfboard, yay. Let's do the knee next. So the knee, there's a few ways we can do it. The main one is the simplest, lock the knee to the surfboard. To do this, I'm just going to take the knee PV control and turn on snap knee on this rig. Boop. Now the knee is going to snap to the PV control, and there we go. Now there is a problem here that you might notice. It's hard to see, but maybe we can spot it. The knee is kind of out of place right now. It's not where it should be. So if you're going to snap the knee like this, first thing you need to do is find out where the knee should be. In this case, I need to find the position of the knee's joint. So I'm going to make sure that my joint visibility is turned on the rig. Then I'm going to go to show. I'm going to turn on joints. right there. Now we see the skeleton of the rig. And there is the knee joint right there. So what I can do is take my knee PV right here, and I'm going to, let's actually delete the animation on here for now. We don't need it. And I'm going to snap it to that joint. So I'm going to select it right here, hold down the V key, and then middle mouse drag on that joint. Make sure I get it right spot there. Okay. So right there. It's snapped. There we go. Now if I turn on snap knee, that doesn't explode. So we've got the knee in place now. At this point, we can actually use this control, and you'll notice that the knee moves with it. So at this point, all we need to do is to constrain the knee to the surfboard. Once again, we can keep it pretty simple here. Because it's just a knee, there's no extra pivot points. We don't need a lot of complexity here. So let's create a new locator. Create locator. And we'll create our little kind of hierarchy setup right here. So we've got our first locator here. I'm just going to create all the locators and move them into place. So our first locator is going to be knee to board. So this is going to be the locator that connects the knee to the board. And actually, let's be a little bit more precise with the name. So because we're doing the hierarchy, this is actually going to be the knee to, or knee constraint. We'll call it that. So this is the thing that the knee is going to be constrained to. Locator. Okay. Let's see. Between using NURBS primitives and locators, honestly, there's no difference. It's just what's easier to see and select. Personally, I like to use locators when you're dealing with constraints because it makes it easy to not have to select them and to hide them. So for example, if I'm setting all of my constraints up and I want to kind of just focus on my animation, I can just go to show, turn off locators. It cleans up the scene. If you have all of your constraints and all of this stuff created using NURBS primitives and NURBS kind of shapes, those get kind of in the way of all your other animation controls. So for me, locators is just a nice way of separating the two. Does it make a difference? Not really. So we've got this one here. Let's duplicate that. And this is going to be our knee pivot. I can type pivot locator. And then we'll duplicate that. And then this is going to be the knee offset. That way, if we need to adjust where the knee is positioned, we can do that. Okay. So this first locator is going to be the leader. So we've got their knee constraint. That's going to be the first one. Then the knee pivot gets parented to that. Knee offset gets constrained to the pivot there. Okay. So at this point, I have to think of how this is going to be set up. So the surfboard is the main moving object. It's the thing that's going to affect everything else. So this knee constraint locator has to be constrained to the surfboard. So the surfboard leads the action. Okay, let's just do that super quick. So take my surfboard, and in this case, I can actually take this locator right here. because they're doing the same thing. And I'm going to constrain my knee constraint locator to the surfboard locator. Okay, so let's add that. Now, as we move the surfboard, those locators move along with. Yay! Now, we have a really cool thing that parenting is going to give us with this layout. And that is that, let me actually undo this here. I'm going to show you what's really powerful about this. So undo, undo, undo. Okay, good. And actually, let me turn off joints because we don't want to select those by accident. So the reason this is also a very powerful constraint setup is it allows us to realign our world axis, or not the world axis, but our object axis based on an object. So what I mean by this is going to be our main locator that follows the surfboard. So let me constrain once again, super quick, just to show you. So apply that. So as we rotate the surfboard, all these locators follow along. Now, let's say we want to adjust our pivot locator, where the knee is adjusting on the surfboard. Well, notice how as I move this, it goes left and right. I'm in object mode right now, so it's lining up with the object, with the locator itself. So as I would try to adjust this locator here, it's not moving along with the surfboard, or I should say along the surfboard. So I have to move it forward and then down. Oh, gotta have it a little lower, forward and down. That's kind of a pain. So I can use just a little bit of forethought. I know that the knee has to slide along the surfboard, up and down the length of it. It's not going to be going in these weird angles. So if I align my first locator correctly, let's undo this so that it's not constrained here. Okay. I'm going to constrain that locator to the surfboard, or to the locator controlling the surfboard, and I'm going to turn maintain offset off first. Hit apply. Oops, and I did it the wrong way. Object that leads, object that follows. Actually, let's do the surfboard here. Object leads, object that follows, apply. You can see that the locators snapped. They realigned themselves to be with the surfboard. Now, if I take my knee pivot here, I can reposition this where I want it to be, right there, and look at its rotation values. They're still zeroed out, even though it's at an angle. As I rotate this, those locators still have a zeroed out rotation value, which means that this is their default space, aligned with the surfboard. Now I can just slide these locators up and down the length of the surfboard easily. Because I realigned the first locator, it makes every other locator in the hierarchy match the orientation of the main object. Okay, what does that give us? Well, let's finish our constraint system here. So this is going to be our knee pivot. Right there, I'm going to put it right where the knee kind of is. Let's make it a little bit bigger too. Technically, it doesn't really matter where it is, but I like to keep things lined up. So right at that point there. And Animated Scott, thank you so much for the subscription. Jeez, 13 months, a year, over a year. Thank you so much. I really appreciate that. Thank you so much. So I'll align that where the knee goes right there. And then I'm just going to constrain the knee to the offset control. Now the offset control, because it's just an offset, it just kind of adjusts with the positioning. We don't really have to worry about where it is. It's just kind of there to be adjusted a little bit. So let's do this. Let's take our offset and constrain the knee to it. Make sure maintain offset is turned on. And let's add that in there. And you'll notice, oop, could not add constraints. Why? What's going on here? Well, a parent constraint constrains translations and rotations. The knee PV has no rotations. It's not working. So this will come up. Sometimes we just need to adjust the constraint. In this case, we might be able to just turn off the rotates and constrain that. And there we go. So it was basically, we were trying to constrain something that didn't exist in the knee PV. But with this, the knee PV will now follow the offset control. We then have our main knee pivot here, which is going to control everything. So I can animate the leg. So the leg now can slide along the surfboard and stay attached to the surfboard at all times. If I need to adjust where it's pivoting from, I can just move this around a little bit. So maybe get that connection just a little bit better right there. So it's not cutting in. There we go. And it follows the surfboard. The surfboard pivots on that. There we go. Done. Now, once again, the reason why we're doing it this way is because visually, even if that surfboard is moving here, we're not going to notice that things are stretching and squashing as long as we animate the foot to match that afterwards. That's fine. It makes it so that we as an animator have more control over it. If we were seeing it from this angle right here, I would do this a different way. But at least for now, we have this very nice setup, which basically allows us to still animate the knee, so the knee can slide up and down if we need to, maybe kind of adjust a little bit this way and this way. And we're just animating the surfboard over top. Okay. And then this offset is just there. It's an offset. It's just there to readjust our constraints so that we're not locked into one, like just constrain it and then that's it. That's where it's pivoting from, nothing more. Okay. So we've got the knee, we've got the surfboard. There we go. And once again, what I like about this setup is you can see both constraint setups right there. Here's our surfboard, here's our knee. If I have to adjust or redo either of them, I don't have to go digging around in a rig for it. They're right there. Okay, let's do this hand because this is going to be the simpler hand to do. So I'm going to place the hand approximately where I want it. So let's say something like that. And we're going to do another very basic locator hierarchy. We don't really need too much on here. So this is going to be the hand to board locator. Let's just kind of move this in place. Now you'll start to notice that, let's see, I'm assuming you would only use this kind of setup as required. Usually as required. If it's a simpler shot, I don't do something like this because it's just a lot more that you don't really need. If I know a character is just going to be holding something and not doing anything with it, I can get away with a simpler constraint setup. Because this has so many moving pieces and so many things that can be adjusted later on. Maybe we want to readjust the position of the hand, adjust the position of the knee. For example, maybe the knee shouldn't be over here, but it should be over here. We want that control. So by creating this, we create a setup that can adjust and be readjusted throughout the shot without losing all the animation we've already built on the constraint. So we've got our hand control, but like I was saying before I forget, we're starting to get a little bit of visual confusion here, where all of the locators are the same color. We've got the locators in here for the knee, they're all one color. The locators down here, all one color. These locators that we're going to add, all the same color. It starts to get very visually dense and hard to know which locators are kind of working for which constraint setup. If ever you want to adjust your locator's visual attributes, just select the locator, go to the attribute editor, and under the locator's main shape node here, or sorry, the main locator node here, just go to display, drawing overrides, turn on enable override, and change the color index right here. So for example, let's make this one pink. There we go. Now I know that the pink locators are for the knee constraint. I can take this one here. So you just have to do the top locator. Enable overrides, and let's make this less blue. There we go. The blue locators are for the surfboard. I can start color coding all of my locators, so I'm not having to deal with green and green and green and green and green, which is not fun to when you've got so many locators just kind of moving around your shot. So let's keep working on this. So we've got the other hand. It's holding the surfboard. We need our first main locator. This is going to be the main one that kind of contains everything. Great. We've got that. Okay. What else do we need? Well, we're going to need a pivot point in the palm, like we were talking about before. Probably right there in the hand, based on the way he's holding this. If he was holding it with more of the base of the hand, we could put a pivot point right there. In this case, it's going to be the fingers. So we know we need a pivot point there. So let's duplicate this. This is going to be the palm pivot. Okay. So we've got our palm pivot. What else will we need? Well, we'll need an offset for that. Usually, whenever I create one locator that's going to be pivoting or something, I create an offset with it. This way I can readjust that position. So this is going to be palm offset. There we go. Okay, what next? Well, we could keep it at that. Honestly, we don't need too much more. If I wanted, though, I could add another pivot. What if I want him at some point to pivot from his fingertips holding the surfboard? I could do that. Let's kind of do this just to show the main kind of setup here. So we're going to take both of these, duplicate that. So we're going to have a finger offset and a finger pivot. So basically, again, it's really just one locator that controls the whole hierarchy, and then a locator for a pivot along with an offset, a locator for a pivot and an offset. So we've got that. And then I'm just going to create one more just to keep things clean and organized. And this is going to be the, what do I want to call this? Let's see. This is basically going to be where the hand constrains the locator, just to keep things nice and organized. So, hand constraint. Okay. So, we've got the hand to board. This is going to be our main locator. This is the one that controls everything. So that's our leader. The palm pivot is going to have the offset parented to that. So our pivot points have an offset parented to it. Same thing here. Finger pivot. Let's put the offset into there. Now, the hand pivot should be parented to the main locator. That lines everything up there. And then the finger pivot, this is where you have to choose. Which pivot is going to be more important? Should the finger pivot be the main pivot point and then you have an additional pivot on the palm? No. In this case, the palm pivot is going to be the most important with a secondary finger pivot if we need it. So I'm going to put the palm pivot first and then the finger pivot after. So we've got the hand to the board, palm pivot, palm offset. Finger pivot goes into the offset. So we're just building this hierarchy, just going lower and lower and lower. Like so. And then the hand constraint locator right to the finger offset. Like that. This whole hierarchy of locators. So would you say being an expert constrainer is needed to be hired for work? No, not at all. You don't need to know any of this. You can animate without constraints. All constraints do is make it faster. So once you learn how to do this, you can make animations that are way more complex, but still easy to animate compared to having to deal with animating everything on every single frame because things are not adjusting correctly. If you think about like 2D animators, they never had constraints. It was all just drawn. We can do the same thing in 3D. So we've got our hand to the board, our main locator here, our hierarchy underneath, and then we need to start attaching things. So the first thing I'm going to do, just because it's going to help make things easier, I'm going to just color correct these. So the hand to board, I'm going to change this. Let's pick a color here. Let's go light blue. There we go. So the first thing I need to do is line up all of these locators with the surfboard. This is going to make it much easier to animate the hand moving along the surfboard. So same thing as I did before. I'm going to take the hand to the board locator. I'm going to constrain it to the surfboard. So surfboard, then hand to board. Open up my constraints and turn off maintain offset. Boop. Now you can see all of those are realigned with the surfboard. There we go. Now I just take each locator and move them into place. So our palm pivot. This is going to line up. Let's actually just move these way out of the way for now. Yep. Palm pivot. This lines up where we want the palm to pivot from. So I'm going to move this right there. So this is where palm should pivot from. Right, actually, right there is going to be the base of the fingers there. So we can get that right about here. Now, typically we tend to pivot a little bit further from the middle finger and kind of middle index finger, depending on how we're holding the weight. In this case, I'm going to put it right there. Okay. Now, palm offset. This is just our offset locator, so I don't really need to worry about where this goes. It's just there to kind of readjust if we need to. Okay. Finger pivot. So this is going to be important. Where is the finger going to pivot from? Well, in this case, most likely the fingers are going to pivot from the edge right here. I didn't pose out the hand, but if you imagine the fingers curling around, they would pivot from kind of this point right here as they're holding onto the surfboard. So let's actually, just for the sake of it, I'm going to take all these finger controls and oops, make sure I set the key here. Okay. So I'm just going to pose out those fingers super quick. So let's say the hand is holding on here. I want the pivots of the fingers to happen maybe right around here-ish. So on that surfboard right there. Finger offset, once again, doesn't really matter where this goes because it's just the offset control. It could be wherever we want. I like to keep them a little bit away so that we're not dealing with kind of a setup that's just so many locators overlaid on top of each other. And Wacko-Matrixo, hello, and thanks so much for the raid. Nice to see you again. Hope you're doing well. Okay, so with that, the last constraint we have is the hand constraint. Now, technically, I don't need this. I didn't do it in the previous one. I just wanted to show a little something different. Basically, the reason for this is just for ease of naming. So that way I know that the offset is an offset. The hand constraint locator is the one that actually has the constraint on it. It's not necessary. And I can just add this wherever I want as well. So let's kind of keep all of our other locators organized over here for now. Okay, so with this, let's constrain the hand to that locator, to the hand constraint locator. So select that locator, select the hand, constrain, and make sure maintain offset is turned on. There we go. With this, the hand now follows the surfboard. Great. But I can animate it from this pivot point here, which means that if I need to adjust the hand, I can translate it, and you'll notice that it translates along the surfboard. So I can have this slide very easily up and down the surfboard without having to lift it up and then down and up and down, anything like that. And as I rotate it, it pivots from that point there. So now I can animate the hand and have it kind of adjust easily along that edge. And because the hand's not moving too much, this is more than enough. So I can have it kind of rotate, and all the weight feels like it's from that point. If I need to animate the fingers there, I can do this. And now we've got the fingers holding as he readjusts his hand. If ever I feel like my pivot points are not in the right place, I can take my palm offset, for example, kind of readjust that a little bit. So now that palm rotates from the center a little bit more. I've created a constraint setup that I can change at any time and readjust based on any potential changes that happen in my animation. Is it complex? Yes. It's a lot of locators just for one constraint, but I have full control over this at any point, and I don't have to worry about losing animation or redoing animation, anything like that. And honestly, once you have this, you can actually just take their offset locators. We don't really need to see them. Just turn them off. If you need to adjust the offset, you can always just select them in the outliner, and you can still move them even if they're turned off. You don't need to see them. So you want to do it that way. Hide the ones you don't need to see. Okay. Now we've got one more setup here, which is the hand on the surfboard. And this one is going to be a little trickier because we need some very specific things. For one, we need the object to be able to slide up and down the surfboard easily. So we need that up and down motion along the length of the surfboard regardless of where the hand is positioned and where it's oriented. So we kind of have this here, but you'll notice that if I rotate this hand too much, like this, it no longer lines up with the surfboard. That's fine in this case because I can use the offset to readjust that, but really this hand is just sticking there, so no worry about having to go even deeper. With the other hand, it's constantly lifting and dropping. So we're going to need more detail in here. And just to kind of keep this clean, I'm going to hide all of my locators here just so we can focus on this new setup. Okay. So we'll need that kind of left and right locator, the along surfboard. We'll also need a locator on the wax to make sure that we get a pivot point on there. The hand is going to be constrained to the wax itself. So we'll need to be able to move the hand along with the wax so that we get that nice offset along in there too. Okay, lots of things we have to kind of prep for here. So once again, we just start building it out. What do we need? Well, first we need our main locator. This can be wax to board. Okay. So this is going to be the most important one. Our wax to board locator. This is the one that's going to attach everything together. Okay. Let's duplicate that. The next locator we need is the side-to-side motion. So the reason I'm thinking of the side-to-side motion first is you want to work your way down. What's the most important motion, and what's the keep in mind that every motion down is affected by the one before it. So if I have this motion up and down of the board, I don't want that to be affected by anything. It's just this, and that's it. If there's rotations, I don't want the rotations of the hand to affect this simple back and forth motion. That's going to be my next locator, is that back and forth. Think of what is going to affect each other. So this is going to be the back forth locator. Okay, so it's going back and forth, back and forth. Now we can create an offset for that, back forth offset. You don't need offset locators, but I always like to, just in case something goes wrong. Nice to have. So let's actually build this out as we go. Okay, so we've got that. Next, we need the wax pivot point. The pivot point of the wax, so that as we go through, we can just pivot on its edge as it gets pulled up. So let's take that, wax edge pivot. Okay. So we've got the edge pivot where the wax is going to go on its edge there. Once it's off though, the wax has to rotate from the wrist. So as his hand is up in the air, we don't want his hand to be rotating from this point over here. It has to rotate from the wrist because he's lifting his hand up into the air. Like that. So he lifts up, get that nice motion, it comes back down, that's back down. So let's call this wax wrist pivot. Okay. Now, what's going to be the more important motion here? We've got the wrist moving along, and that's going to be the biggest motion, and probably the thing that's changing a lot throughout all of this. So that edge pivot should probably go underneath the wrist pivot. That way, regardless of where the wrist is located, that edge can always rotate from the edge. It's not being offset. So let's do that. The wrist pivot, then edge pivot. And just for the sake of it, let's make those offsets. Wrist offset. Again, you don't necessarily need an edge offset. You don't need offset locators, but it's just nice to have. And create that nice hierarchy right in there. Okay, so this is our hierarchy so far. We've got the wax to the board. This is the main one that's connecting the two together. We have our back and forth locator. That's going to control the back and forth motion. we have the wrist pivot, pivoting from this point here. Great. We've got the edge pivot, pivoting from the actual edge of the wax. The only other thing we really need is a center wax pivot. So pivoting from the center of the puck. This way, as it's going down, we can have it rotate and kind of curve along the path of the board. And as he's waxing, you can kind of scrub into it a little bit. So let's duplicate that. So this is going to be, okay, wax center. And I put it above the edge just because, once again, the edge pivot is going to be probably the least used. So I want that to be at the lowest. So we've got that. And we can duplicate again. And this is going to be wax constraint. Okay. Whoa, this is a lot of locators. Do we really need all of this? No. Honestly, like I said, you don't need all the offsets. That's just a backup so that if something needs to be changed, you don't have to redo the whole setup. And honestly, most of these are going to be very faintly used, but they are there in case. And we're going to set this up and then I'll show you why it's so helpful here. So once again, we need to get the wax to the board to attach to the surfboard. So select the surfboard, wax to board, constrain, make sure maintain offset is turned off. This lines everything up with that surfboard right there. So our first constraint is the back and forth constraint. So this locator right here, the back forth, is basically just going to be aligned with the top of the surfboard. I'm going to place it right under the puck, or basically anywhere near the puck right here. Okay. So basically this whole locator's purpose is to go back and forth, in and out, and up and down as the surfboard curves ever so slightly. So you get this very simple motion right through there. Even as the hand picks up, this is going to control the hand picking up and going down. Okay, now we've got our back and forth offset. Let's kind of move this back here just to keep things organized. So, yep, right back there. Okay, we have the next one, our wrist pivot. So where is the wrist going to pivot from? Well, right here. I'm going to pivot from the wrist here. Now, the problem here is this locator doesn't line up with the wrist as it is right here. That's not great. I want this locator to move basically as an extra wrist control that I can animate the hand easily, and as I do, it moves like the actual control. If it's like this, we're going to have these weird rotations where the wrist is just doing crazy things. So I'm going to take this wrist pivot and I'm going to constrain it to the wrist itself temporarily. So wrist pivot. Let's actually take everything else and move it out of the way. Wrist pivot to the wrist. So select the wrist first, then the wrist pivot. Constrain with maintain offset turned off. Oop. You can see it snaps and lines itself up with the wrist. Perfect. Now, I just have to open this up and delete that constraint. There we go. So now, this lines up perfectly with that wrist. Take my wrist offset. Once again, Positioning doesn't matter, so I'm just going to put it like back here somewhere near the arm, so I kind of know that it's for the wrist there. Okay, the wax center. So this is going to be the center of the wax when it's on the board. So we get all of that nice rotation of the wax. Well, same thing. We need it to line up to the wax itself, not to the wrist, to the wax. So I'm going to take the wax this time. I say wax, it's the sponge. And then take the wax center pivot, constrain that. You see it locks in place. Delete the constraint. And now I can just readjust it and boop, right there. Perfectly lined up. And then, oop, and I forgot to rename this. This is center offset. Okay, so the center offset, I'm just going to drag that straight up here. Keep that far away. Edge pivot. Well, since we already constrained the locator, it already kind of realigned it to everything. And we can just put that right there, right at the edge. And then once again, edge offset. Let's kind of move that up here as well. Just keep them close together. And then the wax constraint. Honestly, this doesn't matter where it goes, so I'll just leave it right. Let's actually kind of move it out of the way there. Okay, whew. We've set all of this up. Whoa, that's a lot. Well, let's actually get it connected. So everything's following the surfboard. We can double check. Yes, good. So all we need to do is take the wax and constrain it to the wax constraint. So take the wax constraint locator, then the wax, or the sponge I should say, and let's constrain it, maintain offset turned on. Okay. Whew. What does this give us after all of that? Well, as I'm animating this now, like I said, I can animate the wax going back and forth with this locator right here. As it's going and needs to be picked up, I can adjust it from the center or from the edge or from the wrist. So once we get the hand in, you'll see how this works. And why do you move the offsets far away? I always have my offsets so I can use them as offsets for the thing I constrained. So I keep them where the constraint is. It basically, the offsets don't really matter where they are. You can keep them together if you prefer, or you can put them way off. Because of the way the hierarchy works, they're really just there to create an offset on the main control. So for example, let's say I want to move the edge. So instead of pivoting on this edge here, I want to pivot from the back edge. I can just take my edge offset there and just kind of move it back. And you'll notice that it's adjusting that edge pivot right there. Then it pivots from that edge. So it doesn't really matter where it is. It could be anywhere. In this case, I'm moving them so far away just for visual purposes. Usually I try to keep them closer or even like right on top of each other, but it just makes it hard to see in a demo purpose for seeing where everything is. So yeah, in this case, actually, like if you want to really go in detail here, one thing that would be really cool. So let me get rid of the constraint on the wrist here. This is just to show a really cool trick. Okay, good. So I'm going to take the edge pivot, and we know that the edge pivot has to line up, or the edge pivot always has to line up with an edge. So if I take my edge offset here and snap it, where is it? Where are you hiding? There we go. I hide, I snap that to the center of the sponge here, because it's a cylinder, we can basically get it so that if ever I need to offset the edge here, so edge pivot, all I need to do there we go, is rotate that, and you can see how that edge, or that pivot point, goes right along the edge. So right there. So take that offset, whoop, and it's right along the edge. So you could do something like that. It really just depends on how you want to set it up. So let's get this constrained once again. Okay, there we go. So let's double check that this works. It does, yay. We've got this horrifying constraint setup right there. Okay, with that, we just need to constrain the hand into place. So let me just set these colors so that we can kind of see the difference here. Okay, let's pick tan. We'll go tan. Okay, so we just need one more constraint setup, the wrist to the wax. So to do this, once again, create locator. This is going to be wrist to wax. Move that up there, and we're going to do this one very basically. We could go very deep, but honestly we probably just need 3. So it's going to be wrist to wax, wrist pivot, and then our offset. There we go. So we'll just keep it simple. Boop. And then like so. So let's constrain this. The first locator is going to get constrained to the wax. So the wax is the leading force here. So I'm going to take the wax, and actually let's just turn off our other locators here just to simplify this visually. There we go. So our wrist to wax, the first thing is constrain the locator to the wax. Boop. There we go. And I turned off maintain offset so it lines up with the wax itself. Okay. Now, the wrist pivot, where do we want the wrist to line up with? So in this case, I want the wrist. So actually, let me explain something I'm doing here. So I'm noticing that when I constrain it to the wax, see how it's really offset from the wrist? It's kind of at a different angle here. I'm going to delete the constraint, use the main wrist to wax locator, and just realign that so that it kind of lines up with the arm just a little bit. Something like that. And then reconstrain it with maintain offset turned on. Basically what I'm doing there is just making sure that my locators will all line up with the wax properly. Okay, so our wrist pivot, let's kind of put it there, and then the offset can go wherever we want, and constrain the wrist to the offset there. Okay, so same thing as before. The main locator starting the whole thing, we've got our pivot point there, and then we've got our offset, which allows us to adjust that pivot point. Now, the hand, and did I not constrain that? Oops, I went the wrong way. It helps if you constrain things the correct way. So let's see, wrist offset, there it is. So that, and then the IK wrist. There we go. So now, as I pivot this, the hand pivots around that point of the wax. So as he's pressing down, we can get that nice motion in the wrist and then just offset the fingers a little bit. Right there. Okay. So, everything's finally working. With this, let's bring in our horrifying constraint setup here. Once again, hide the locators you don't need when you're not using them, or else it's just kind of a mess here. But with this, I can now animate the surfboard rocking up and down, just like that. As he's moving, the hands go along with. With the wax, all I need to do is animate my back and forth. So I could animate that going from here. Let's just set some keys super quick. It's gonna be a little slow. So let's say I've got that nice swipe there. Just like that. And I can just animate that going back and forth, back and forth. As it's doing that, I can use my center pivot right here. So let's actually set a key here. As he's pushing it here, you see how his wrist is starting to break? Let's just realign that here. So his wrist is at a natural angle on both keys here. So as he's sliding this along now, we get that nice natural motion super easily. I could even maybe have that drag a little bit more this way, just a little. And let's drag it just a little bit more here. So now we get a little bit of a drag on that wrist. And it still follows the surfboard perfectly. I could add maybe a little bit of an arc. So the back and forth. Let's add just a little bit of an arc to it so it comes out this way as well. Now we get that nice little arcing motion. And everything works. I can just layer all of these motions in easily. Once he picks up his hand here, all I would need to do is take the wrist pivot, and I can animate the hand picking up and moving there. Put it back down. There we go. So at all of these points, I have full control. So now I pick it up and I can actually control it from the wrist. Get all of that nice kind of motion in the wrist. It comes down. I can animate it going to this point. It touches down. I can use the edge pivot to bring it down perfectly. And keep animating. So even with all of this, it still works. So that's the constraint setup. Now, you have to go this far? No. Honestly, this is a very complex constraint setup. But it is the one that's going to give you the most options and give you the most ability to polish this with very little work. So once you get the main surfboard motion in there, everything else just gets layered on top and it's polished right away. You're not going to have to make tiny little adjustments. And let's say, for example, I've got this side to side motion right here. And oh shoot, I need to adjust the surfboard and rotate it. There you go. All of the animation works. It's not going to snap and get all weird. It just works. So it's complex, but it gives you that freedom. And this type of setup is something that you can use for like pen spins. I did a demo on how to do that. how to have a character using like a screwdriver where they have to hold it in their hand and then put it into a place and then kind of do this and then pull it back out. It's all variations of this setup. And as you saw, yeah, basically you only have the elbow left to animate. You just have to animate the PV control of the elbow and you're done. Is there a constraint limit in Maya? No. You can have, maybe there is a constraint limit. I don't think there is. If there is, it's so high that you're never going to reach it. Especially not as an animator. So I hope this makes sense. I know, again, it is confusing. It's one of these things where when you're first learning this constraint setup, it's going to be hard to work it in. I would suggest just keep it simple. Add like 3 locators. Just do that simple 3 locator hierarchy. That's going to get you most of the way for most of this. And then if you feel ready to kind of push further with it, just add a few more locators. It really makes life a lot easier for these types of complex kind of coordinated motions.